I'd rather be miserable at my job and be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment than follow my dreams and live in a studio apartment.
Capitalism is a prison.
If you would be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself for the podcast?
Hi, this is Aidan Baker. I'm a musician from Canada. I play solo and with a few different projects, probably the best known of which is Nadja with my partner Leah.
And you're also fairly prolific as a solo artist as well, right?
Yes.
How would you describe the music that you make?
Um, Generally, I use the words ambient and experimental, which is pretty broad, but it's kind of a good catch-all, I guess, for what I do generally.
Tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get involved in music? When did you start your first band?
My parents are both musicians, so music was always in the house. Started, I guess, with piano when I was, I don't know, like 6 or 7 or something, very young age, and then switched to classical flute, which was my main instrument for a long time as a teenager. It's a fairly limited world, classical flute. So I started teaching myself guitar when I was, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13, I guess. And the first band I started, I was probably 15, and it was sort of a wave punk kind of band.
Was this in Canada?
Yes, yeah, just outside of Toronto, small town outside of Toronto.
Coming from a classical background, did you gravitate towards heavier music like rock or metal?
At the time, not so much, no. I was more, I mean, when I started playing guitar, my ability was pretty limited, so I kind of naturally gravitated towards punk and stuff that was more about expression than technical ability. So even if I had musical training and could read and stuff, my guitar playing was more kind of instinctual or intuitive. So it was more about making sounds than it was about trying to play something specific or composed or structured. So I think that led me more towards like an experimental angle, less towards metal and heavier music at first. So like bands like Sonic Youth were a pretty big influence on my guitar playing, which is more about exploring sounds and textures and ways of playing to make new sounds rather than specific technique.
How did Nadja come about?
I started doing sort of more ambient experimental music solo in the late 90s, early 2000s. And at that point, I was listening to heavier music, generally a bit more in the industrial or sort of experimental metal scenes rather than typical mainstream metal, I guess. So while I was doing this mellow ambient stuff under my own name, I felt a need for an outlet to do heavier, noisier music. So I started Nadja as kind of a flip side to my solo music that I was making. So it was essentially the same setup, like the same gear, same equipment, just I kind of flipped it on its end, and instead of being ambient and minimal, it was loud and minimal and heavy and noisy, based on distorted textures rather than more ambient texture.
Where would you say the impulse to make heavier music came from? Was it anything you were listening to at the time, or was it just an urge you felt naturally?
Well, a bit of both, I guess. The various punk bands that I played in kind of morphed into more sort of noisy music or heavier, but I guess like this was in the grunge years, so we were kind of playing grunge, but it was like angular, weird grunge, and not like Nirvana, more like, I don't know, Slug or Steel Pulp Bathtub or something like this. That was more about noise and weird sounds fitting into a song structure rather than the song structure being the focus. So I had this idea that I wanted to keep playing that, but as a solo musician, it wasn't so viable the way I was working, the equipment that I had, and the people I was working with, at least. So when I first heard bands like Sun and Con8 in particular, or Boris, I thought, oh, this is kind of the direction I want to explore, because it took this sort of heavy experimental noise sound and took it into a more ambient headspace, I guess. So it kind of combined my personal listening preferences from this sort of ambient experimental music and purpose of metal to make metal music that wasn't necessarily metal in the traditional sense.
What are your feelings about traditional metal, so to speak?
I was never a huge metalhead. Like as I said, I always played in punk bands. So when I was a teenager, the punks and the metalheads were quite divided, and each kind of hated each other. And respectively, you didn't listen to metal music if you were a punk, which is ridiculous to have those distinctions. I think, but like teenagers, you don't think so much about that kind of thing. So a lot of like the typical metal stuff, I still don't necessarily listen to because in my formative years, it wasn't something that I really appreciated. That said, I still like Slayer, but if you could label Slayer as a more punk metal band, I guess. Certainly, like Rain and Blood, that's definitely more kind of punk sounding album than like Metallica, for example.
I should point out that with Nadja, you actually did cover a Slayer song.
Yes, we did. And a lot of people hated it because they thought, what is it? It sounds like it's recorded in an elevator or something. I think I heard somebody say,
Sorry, do you mean that metal fans hated it? Hated your version of it?
Yes.
Okay.
There were a lot of people that really liked it, but we also got a lot of people saying, "Oh, I don't understand what this is." Which, to be fair, if you haven't heard ambient metal, then it's gonna sound weird to you.
Yeah, I would like to talk about that cover album a little bit, particularly one song. But for the record, I do like that EP, and I do like your version of the Slayer song.
Not sure.
common knowledge, but the name Nadja is actually your name backwards.
And that was sort of part of the impetus of me making the flip side of what I was doing with my own name. So, it's kind of the A side and the B side of my musical expression, so to speak.
So did you always envision your projects under your own name and Nadja as being this kind of yin-yang?
Yeah, originally when I first started it, yeah, because it was just me in the studio really, and it wasn't until we started releasing records and getting uh, requests to play live that I thought about expanding it to a duo and asking me to join the project. And a big part of that was because I didn't feel like I could properly express it by myself uh, in a live setting, and I needed a partner to do it. And that definitely changed the project because it became a duo, and that automatically changes things, having a second input into the way we worked. And definitely for the better, I think. And certainly being able to play live changed the project a lot too. Also, in terms of musical evolution for the better, of course.
When did Leia become involved?
Like 2005, so maybe I guess I started the project maybe 2 years prior to that, 2 or 3 years prior.
Did you expand to a duo purely just to play live?
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, well, we started working with Alienate Recordings in Montreal in I guess late 2004, and they wanted to do a proper record, but there was an expectation of doing live concerts behind that. So before I started composing the songs even for that record, I talked to Thea about joining, and we worked on the album together. So that first record, Truth Becomes Death, is really kind of the pivoting point of when it moved from a solo studio project to a duo live project.
And was this the album Touched?
No, this was Truth Becomes Death.
I am a little bit curious about how you see the project, because when I first discovered Nadja, it was kind of lumped in with a lot of you mentioned Boris and Sano, and I think there's this perception of Nadja as being a drone metal band.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I think it's accurate to a certain degree. I mean, we try to be a bit more than that, and I think the way we differ from like Sun, for example, is our use of melody and stuff, and that might be more of a shoegaze influence. And arguably Boris has that too, and I know they've covered like on the Valentine and stuff too, so they obviously have that shoegaze element in their song too, but they're also a bit more like, I don't know, metal than they are in a way.
And you feel Nadja sticks more onto the experimental side, even though there's some overlap.
Yeah, generally, I guess. I mean, that goes both ways because some of our albums are more structured and, you know, even kind of pop in a way than experimental, but then we also have albums that are pretty abstract. Yeah, I guess we kind of fit in between Boris and Sun in a way that we can be as abstract as Sun and but can be as structured as Boris.
How would you describe the development of Nadja stylistically? Would you say there's a development?
Yes, as I mentioned, playing live changed the band a lot, and I think in the early years we were still more reliant on making sounds in the studio, and then after we did some touring, I think that idea kind of changed a bit, or the methodology changed a bit, that we approached recording or composition in a way that we could both do in the studio and reproduce live. Not for every song, of course, but being able to play at least segments of an album in a live context was important to how we presented the album and the project.
And is it just the two of you with the drum machine?
Normally, yes, we've played a few times with other people, either like a guest performer or some of like our collaborative albums where we played with the band.
So this last album that you put out, Sunborner, seems to be a little bit of a shift stylistically. There are a couple songs that, from from my point of view, because I don't really come from an experimental or ambient background. I'm
Right.
pretty much a metal hardcore kind of guy. But there are parts that remind me of old industrial metal bands like Godflesh or even Fetus and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It seems like the drum machine became more prominent on certain tracks.
Yeah, that's possible. Certainly the faster tracks are more reliant on the drum machine. And industrial music has definitely been an influence on us, and Godflesh and Fetus are both good examples of that, I think.
Was this an intentional shift? Was this something you wanted to explore with the faster songs?
Yeah, we did an EP 2 years ago that also had faster songs, and that was a fun experiment for us. But it was a 7 inch originally, so it was just a shorter album, and we wanted to use that, as we were calling it, grind gaze style in an album context. And the best way we thought to do that was to juxtapose it with a more sort of classic doom track, like the title track, and then have it long and slow juxtaposed next to short and fast.
What was the 7 inch?
It was called Tangled in 2004 or 2000.
experience with a number of musicians. Tell me about working with Blackboned Angel.
There's actually not too much to tell about that. We've never met them before, and everything that we did was via file sharing online. And that collaboration was set up through a label, $20 spin. We thought it would make an interesting pairing. And obviously Campbell and I had had contact through his various solo projects and stuff too. So we knew each other at least kind of peripherally, but we had never really talked about doing something collaboratively until the $20 spin suggested it.
Were you familiar with his music before collaborating with him?
Yeah, I knew Blackboned Angel and Birchville Cat myself.
It's an interesting pairing because if Nadja presents kind of the shoegazing ambient side of drone and doom drone, Blackboned Angel is very much the metal side. Their music is all about overload and kind of this constant, intense, crushing feeling.
Yeah, and I think combining our melodicism with that sort of crushiness that they bring is an interesting, or was an interesting approach to collaborating.
Have you collaborated with Campbell since then?
We haven't, no. We still keep in touch a little bit, but it's been a while since we've talked about music at all, really.
Another artist that you collaborated with is the Japanese project Vampilia. Is that how you say that?
Yeah,
How did you get involved with them?
they initially got in touch with us to do a remix for a remix album they were doing, and then suggested that we come to Japan and tour with them. To which we said, of course, because why would you turn down an opportunity to tour in Japan? And then once we got to meet them, we got along quite well, and even if our music was quite different, we thought we had some interesting similarities, and the combination of the differences made for an interesting combination. So we've actually collaborated 3 times now, 4 times, I've forgotten, 3 or 4 times anyway.
And was the collaboration similar to the Blackboned Angel one? Were you guys sharing files over the internet?
Yeah.
What's that process like? How much input do you have on what the other collaborator is going to make? Do you guys kind of brainstorm beforehand and come up with stuff separately before combining it? Or is it really you have no idea what the other person is going to do?
It really depends on the individuals involved, I think. Sometimes it's more thought out and planned, and other times it's quite freeform and it's just kind of a surprise. I guess with Vampilia, because the group itself is so large, that it's a bit more structured and planned, and they have an idea of what they want to do. But with the Blackboned Angel collaboration, I think for both of us it was pretty sort of spontaneous and just kind of worked on our own parts separately and then combine them, see what happens. And I find that can be pretty exciting sometimes because it creates results that you don't necessarily expect, especially if you're working separately like that and you don't know how the other person is progressing or what direction they're going. And sometimes, of course, it doesn't work, but other times that sort of mashup of similar direction but different expression makes really interesting sounds.
And who's actually doing the combining? Is it you or is it Campbell?
I think we did both actually for the EP, the Craig San White EP. Campbell did the mixing, and for the album proper, I did the music.
So the last collaboration I'd like to talk about is the No Place album that you did with Simon Joff and Thor from Swans.
Yeah,
How did that come about?
we all knew each other from various, I don't know, various connections, but had never actually played together. Simon and I had played a few times live in various settings, and I think Simon and Thor had played together with Thor's project, Thor and Friends, but the three of us hadn't. And Thor had an afternoon off in Berlin, so we said, let's record. So it was very spontaneous and pretty, just, go into the studio, set up, hit record, played for 2 hours, and that was the album, basically.
Did you have an idea of what kind of music you wanted to make before you guys met up?
No, that was an instance of just saying, "What should we play?" And we all just kind of looked at each other and said, "I don't know. Let's just play and see what happens." So that was very intuitive. There was not really any discussion or planning at all. It was just, let's see what comes out.
And how do you feel about the finished result?
I'm quite happy with it. I mean, we did play for 2 hours, so there was a lot of stuff that wasn't worth keeping. But it's not like it was all instant gold. So we did like work on crafting the recordings into an album. But the end result, I think, was quite satisfying. And actually, we just recorded a follow up a few months back, and that also we didn't really talk about in terms of direction, but as it was, as with the recording session was after a tour we did, we were quite used to playing with each other at that point, so it was uh, quite a different experience going into the studio after playing together for 3 weeks than the initial recording. So I think in a way it sounds similar, but it's a lot more accomplished because we knew our playing styles so much better. So it makes for kind of a different album, even if it's a similar sound. Uh, the songs are a bit more concise, I guess, or a little more coherent.
Cool. When's the second collaboration coming out?
We haven't set a date yet, but it probably be in spring 2020 sometime, also with Keith Records.
one last piece of music that I wanted to talk about is on the covers album that we mentioned. You did a cover of Long Dark Twenties, which is from the Kids in the Hall movie. Why did you pick that song?
I don't remember originally why that was originally released on a 7-inch prior to the album, and I don't recall if the label asked us to do a cover or if we just decided we wanted to do a cover. I think the label might have asked us, and we chose this song because we were both big fans of Kids in the Hall, and it was one a bit of Canadiana because it's a Canadian comedy troupe, and we wanted to like say, yeah, we're Canadian fans, so we cover some obscure Canadian comedy that doesn't necessarily get out into the world so much. And also because we wanted to do something that was kind of fun or silly in a genre that's not especially known for being fun or silly.
I mean, but the song itself is kind of dark, and your version of it really kind of slows it down and glooms it up.
Yeah, I mean, the lyrics are quite gloomy and glum, but the original song is fairly bouncy and kind of happy sounding. And,
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of juxtaposition of happy and darkness is something that, I mean, we always kind of work with the juxtaposition in general. But I think that's also something that appealed to us about Kids in the Hall, that their humor was very whimsical but dark at the same time. And I think that comes through in the song, and that was something that was appreciated about it.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. The fact that you guys covered both a Slayer song and a Kids in the Hall song is one of the things that turned me on to you.
Yeah, that was pretty intentional with that album, is to like, try to skew people's expectations a little bit. So as much as we wanted to say this is the stuff that we grew up on listening to and informed our sound, we also wanted to say, lighten up a bit, have some fun with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found this out a while later, actually, fairly recently. But Paul Bellini, who was one of the writers for Kids in the Hall and who's the credited writer for that song, actually came from kind of this post-punk experimental background himself. He and Scott Thompson had a band called Mouth Congress. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah. I didn't know that was them, but I knew the band Mouth Congress, yeah.
Yeah, that was them. And so it's interesting that, you come from this Canadian experimental kind of punk offshoot scene, and you ended up covering the song, which was also an offshoot of that same scene, sort of from that same scene.
Yeah, oh, that's cool. Yeah, when we did the cover, we wrote to Paul to ask his permission to do it, and he was quite nice about it all. Very cool. I thought it was a pretty funny idea that we did, and enjoyed the cover as well. He said we wrote to all of the bands that we covered, not because we had to necessarily, but just to say, hey, we're covering your song. Here it is if you want to listen to it. And only Paul Bellini and Michael Jura answered, and the guys from Cody, but nobody else answered.
Slayer didn't get back to you?
No, sadly.
I'm sure at this point they're used to bands covering their music. I think it kind of goes along with being in Slayer.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your record company.
Okay.
When did you form Broken Spine?
I guess maybe 2010 we started it, and we only release our own projects with this label, and it's really about like maintaining a catalog because we're touring and performing live so much. It's always necessary to have merchandise for sale because that's really how most people buy records these days at shows. So we got kind of tired of like relying on another label to have our stock, and we'd always have to get more copies. So putting it into our own hands really gave us a lot more control and a lot more ability to have stuff on hand and bring it to people when we're playing live.
And you do digital as well as physical releases, correct?
Yeah. We don't do so many physical releases, like one a year or one every 2 years generally, but the means of releasing stuff is a little more is easier, of course. So we try to do that just to maintain the kind of flow of releases coming out.
Now, do all your projects end up on Broken Spine, or are there certain projects that you release on other labels?
There are things that we release on other labels, yeah. I guess in recent years it's mostly just with Giza Records or Carl Records, which is a fairly experimental label here in Berlin. Those are the ones that we work with most consistently in the last couple of years at least.
How did you get involved with Giza?
Don't remember. We were put in touch with one of Rich's old bands called Glissando.
That's an amazing band.
Yeah, and we had talked about touring together in the UK, and it never actually happened, but that was, I guess, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago when that project was still active. And we just got it sort of made contact that way. And then I'm not sure how we actually first started working with Giza, but that was the first connection. And since that time, I've toured with a couple of Rich's projects, the Son of Missing mostly, um, maybe 3 or 4 times now, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. Richard Knox is doing something very similar to what you're doing, which is he's got a number of experimental and ambient bands which he releases on his label.
Yeah, so we definitely felt a shared aesthetic, both in terms of musically and like a work aesthetic, to approach the business of doing musicians and touring and releasing.
And you collaborated with his band, A Son of Missa, right?
Yeah, just in a live setting. We've never actually recorded anything together.
How did that come about? Were you touring and you guys decided to jam together?
Yeah, we were touring and did a radio session with a friend of ours in France. And I don't know if our friend suggested it or if it was something he suggested, but we each did a solo set for the radio session, and then the band just got together and played for like 20 minutes or so, just to experiment and see what happens. And then on a subsequent tour, when the lineup of us on the message was a bit different, I played with them on each show as a second guitarist, in addition to my own set.
So you're currently based in Berlin.
Yes.
How did you end up moving out there?
We came mostly for the musical opportunities that exist in Europe and don't in Canada, really. And there's a good music scene in Canada and lots of interesting bands coming from there, but the country is huge and the population is small, so it's really difficult to exist as a touring musician there. So we found ourselves coming to Europe twice a year, but also missing out on opportunities that we couldn't take advantage of because we weren't living here. So it made more sense to move here and explore being a musician on the continent, and then just being able to play when people ask, and tour when we have the opportunity, rather than having to schedule everything and fly over at the expense of that. Made more sense living there.
And are you there on a performer's visa?
We initially were it's technically a freelancer visa, but most people in Berlin call it the artist visa. And for the first couple of years, we were on this visa. Now we're on sort of an open residency visa, but it's still kind of tentative, even though we've been here almost 10 years. Our status is still kind of vague.
And so you're allowed to tour through Europe, I guess the EU, and when you leave, can you come back?
Yeah. I mean, our visas they're official visas, but they expire every 2 years, and we have to go each time prove that we're culturally relevant, that we're financially stable.
What's that process like? Do you have to submit albums that you've recorded and videos of performances?
Initially, yeah, when we first applied, we had to show like a track history in Europe and in Germany specifically, and also interest from German companies that wanted to work with us as representatives of agencies and such. But since the refugee crisis, the focus has shifted less from cultural relevance to monetary, pretty much. So the last few times, it's mostly just about our bank balance, which is kind of depressing, but it's a reality, and we have to deal with it.
So, finishing up, what's next for you? What do you have planned for Nadja and for Broken Spine and your own solo projects?
Well, I had for solo stuff, I have this trio with Simon and Ford that we need to finish up the album, finalize the mix and such. With Nadja, we just started working a follow up to Sunborner, so that's still in the demo phase. So I'm not really sure when that will likely see any kind of release, but it's maybe a little more maybe doomy or sludgy. We're trying to take a little more of a different direction with this album. That's kind of a more stripped down approach than our usual kind of wild noise. So it takes more the heaviness from the riffs rather than a washes of atmosphere.
When we were talking about Nadja, I actually failed to ask you about your gear setup because you have one of the most burnt out guitar sounds I've ever heard.
Okay.
I mean, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I like the guitar sound.
Okay.
Are you just recording it at peak, or is it your gear setup?
It's the gear setup. Yeah, it's not recorded at peak. The pedal array has, I think, 3 distortion pedals in it. So often that sort of noise crunch sound is the layering of those 3 distortions together.
Interesting. And you self-record everything, right?
For the most part, yeah.
Do you have a home studio, or are you working off of a computer?
Working off a computer. We have a live room that we do some live recording in, but once we do that, we usually get bumped into the computer and we work with it.
Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think we've covered a good range of topics.
Cool, man. I appreciate you doing this.